Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast for sustainable procurement. I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company, and I'm delighted to introduce today Freer Goldstein from the United States. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So, Julia, tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us a bit about your background and how you became involved in sustainability and then how that role has emerged as an author and a consultant.
Certainly. To some degree, I can trace it back to my PhD research back in the 1990s. I guess I date myself then. And I had decided to look into lead-free solders because I was hearing about upcoming regulations from the EU that might be restricting the use of lead and a bunch of other materials in electronics. That was in the early 90s. And I was thinking, well, wait, maybe some of these solders without lead would have similar properties to the leaded solders, the tin lead that was typically used. And, did that research and then worked in the electronics industry. And I was actually working on some projects that were using some lead-free solders. I wouldn't say that then that was where my whole career went. I was always the engineer who would write, so I ended up writing for a lot of different publications. And then I believe it was in 2017 when I said, I've been a professional writer for over 15 years, but I haven't written a book. How can I really be a writer if I haven't written a book? And honestly, of course I was a writer. I had loads of published reports, articles, etc. But in any case, when I thought about what it needed to be about, I thought about my fascination with material science that started back in college when I took an intro to material science course my junior year and said, oh, this is so fascinating, hence the PhD in material science. And I also started thinking more about all of the social and environmental impacts of these fascinating materials that engineers were creating. And the idea that, well, just because you can create something doesn't always mean you should. And therefore, I just started researching. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And then my focus really became more on, let's look at some of those environmental concerns around materials and around changing how we make things and how we choose materials, how we source them, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. So your thinking, your kind of philosophy goes into the engineering side, into the sort of fundamental design of materials. Would that be where you come from as an engineer and a scientist?
That is where I come from, with the idea that, well, you can just add a little bit, certain additives or alloy metals a different way or process things in a certain way, right? What temperatures you're doing to have different properties. And I find that is so fascinating. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it often involves some very toxic elements and compounds and chemicals. And sometimes those are necessary because there isn't really a good other alternative, but sometimes they're not. And there's, regardless, even if you have to use these toxic chemicals, you have to be very careful that they're not ending up in the wastewater. And that's been a huge problem. I have written about that in, numerous examples over some are from 100 years ago and some are from very recent because this problem has not gone away, even though, we had OSHA put in place quite a long time ago, before my time, and that's made workplaces safe, but it hasn't solved all the problems.
Absolutely. And do you find that engineers and designers think about these things? I mean, you're saying that there's some kind of quite fundamental thinking needs to go into a very early stage when we're thinking about products. How sophisticated is our engineering community, or Is it still the same old, we do it this way because we've always done it this way?
There's a mix. There is definitely some of the we've always done it this way. And I wouldn't say that is unique to engineers. That's humans. We get used to doing things a certain way, and that's the default. And changing and doing something different takes effort that not everybody's willing to put in. However, especially the younger generations are coming into the workplace saying, we don't just want a job. We don't just want to try to do the work that, is what we studied in school. We want to work for a company that believes in making the world a better place and not just making millions and millions of dollars. And even people of my generation have shifted their thinking. Of course, there's some who maybe were behind this all along. And even people older, when it was was the hippie thing to do and it was a fringe kind of idea. In terms of engineers, I do know quite a few who do really care. They also have not necessarily been able to implement some of those concerns into their work as much as they would like because of all the constraints. Now, there's real constraints in terms of the design, and there's constraints because of physics. There's also the demands of their employers. There's the financial constraints. There's the space constraints. There's the time constraints. And you put all that in, and the key thing is performance. Can you design the thing to perform according to the expectations that the customer wants, and ideally even exceed those and compete in the marketplace? Can you do it for X amount of dollars per part or per kilogram or what have you? And can you get it done by this and such date, because we need to release it to the customer? And so those are a lot of pressures. Ideally, engineers should never be asked to compromise their ethics. There's an engineering code of ethics, and there's some unfortunate companies that tell engineers to ignore it. A key one that I think about, and I've written about this one, is Volkswagen, VW. If you remember the whole diesel thing, right? With so-called clean diesel. Well, I bought one of those cars in 2011. Ironically, the fuel efficiency and the promise of clean diesel is part of what I liked. And then that was not the case. The engineers at VW were forced to do a workaround because the company didn't want to spend $300 and something on an additional part that would actually make the emissions better. Instead, they created this cheat software. So if you're writing code, you can make it do all kinds of things. If you're an ethical engineer, you're going to think about, wait a minute, I don't want to write code to do that thing. But then you get fired. I mean, it depends on where you work. So I wish that kind of thing didn't happen. But I mean, it's, I suppose, idealism in a little bit of a way, but there's a chance to speak up. And maybe some people might have to risk getting fired from a company that's really doing the wrong thing, but hopefully not get completely blacklisted and maybe be able to find a job at a company that is going to use their skills, trust them, and allow them to behave ethically and have a job where they feel like they are doing good in the world.
Yeah, this is fascinating, isn't it? Because we have to be realistic. But I'm also really inspired by your comments about younger people, because that's certainly my experience as well. We employ a lot of young people in our business now, not just sustainability consultants. We've got marketing people, we've got IT developers, but people come and work with us because they want to be associated with this whole sustainability movement, not necessarily as sustainability experts. So it's not just Gen Z people are coming into the workplace and saying, I want to be a sustainability consultant. They might be saying, I want to be an accountant, but I want to work with an organization that has those right ethical principles. So it does
Exactly.
make you feel a little bit more optimistic for the future. Yeah, the Volkswagen example is a great one, and one that was often quoted to me going back to the 1960s, the Ford Pinto, where the petrol tanks were exploding, but Ford decided it would be cheaper to compensate people who die in an exploding car than actually change the design. And that's I know that's a well recorded, quite old example now, but
Oh yeah, but no, I remember. I mean, from my childhood, that the
yeah,
example of a car that was unsafe was a Ford Pinto.
yeah, that's right,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. Tell me about your book, your latest book, building a circular future.
Yes, it's called Materials and Sustainability, Building a Circular Future. Because I often say, well, I write about and I talk about materials and sustainability. And hey, that's actually the title of my latest book that came out in April. And this book was based on my first book. I mentioned that back in 2017, I started this idea of writing a book about these similar topics. That one was called Material Value, came out in 2019. And this is, to some degree, an update from that. It's also got loads of brand new content, including interviews with 24 experts from around the world, a few of the same people I interviewed for Material Value, but in that case, a new interview to see, what's happened. I mean, things have happened in the last 5 years. I have a co-author for this book. My first 3 books I wrote on my own. Paul Foxariano, he bought Material Value, reached out to me, and we engaged in a conversation. And a couple years later, it turned into agreeing that a second edition is warranted because the book is still good. Also, a lot of things have changed. Some of the companies that I mention in that book are no longer in business. Other things have taken over. It's time for an update. And I also realized, well, I didn't really have time to do it all myself. So therefore I said, I got a deal for you, Paul. How about you work together with me on this? We'll collaborate. And we added brand new chapters. So Material Value covers metals and plastics primarily. There's chapters in materials and sustainability on glass, pulp and paper products, and novel materials. That includes bioplastics. So took kind of some of the stuff from the plastics chapter of Material Value that was more about bioplastics, and that's now in the bioplastics chapter. But everything is updated, and there's always so many new materials coming out. Again, Paul, did the initial drafts of those new chapters. We split up the interviews. It was actually really great collaborating. I love working with other people. I am a solo entrepreneur I have a virtual assistant, I have a bookkeeper, but I don't have any regular team of employees that I'm working with. I collaborate with my clients, but I really do love that kind of interactive working together on a joint goal and creating something better than either of us could have just done on our own. So that's really exciting. And it was really great to do all these interviews with people around the world. I think 9 different countries.
Yeah, it must be a pretty lonely life writing a whole book on your own. Working with somebody else must be quite a relief. It's interesting, this whole area of exploring new materials and new technologies and bio-based materials. I think you mentioned as well. One of the things that I've found is obviously something new comes into the market. It's not regulated in the way that materials previously were. And sometimes there's unintended consequences. We did a piece of work in my organisation recently on HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oil, and found all sorts of issues in there with forced labour, with palm oil, rainforest destruction, all of those things. Everybody's going, yeah, wow, HVO, I can reduce 90% of my emissions if I buy HVO instead of buying diesel. But actually, because this is a new material that's not as well regulated as traditional oil and gas might be, then potentially there are kind of unintended consequences of procuring that material. Do you see examples of that in your work?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that phrase unintended consequences, I remember I thought of maybe incorporating that into a title or subtitle of one of my books at one point. the trick is to look holistically. The other issue is sometimes we can't completely trust everything that we're hearing because we're not always hearing the whole story. And the media may fixate on one little aspect of saying, oh no, we're doing all this horrible mining to make batteries, therefore we shouldn't be putting out electric vehicles. That doesn't tell about all the horrible stuff that's happening when we're mining the fossil fuels to keep fueling those internal combustion engine cars and then running them. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't consider the effects of mining. We absolutely should. And then when you think about palm oil, well, there's the whole, roundtable on sustainable palm oil and the idea, but only, and again, the number could have changed. The last I looked, 20% of the palm oil in the world was certified in this manner. So it's a matter of looking at the certifications, but also looking at if you're going to use this new material, right? Say a biofuel, compare it to what it's replacing and then say, well, maybe you're going to say it's still better. Now, there's also the issue of supplies, right? How much can you get? That's another thing. And if you were trying to increase supplies, if you needed to make 10 times more, which you would, more than that even, if you're really going to make everything fueled by biofuels, well, how would you do that? And if doing that means, so many more acres of farmland that then's going to be used to make oil, there's a piece that says, wait, isn't there something wrong with that picture? Maybe there's a better way. And so doing projections, calculations, looking at the science. And that means sometimes digging more deeply beyond the headlines, beyond, one or two anecdotes to say, let's really look at this whole thing from beginning to end. And what would it take to scale it in this way? How fast is it realistically possible to scale? And how fast should we scale given all of the ramifications? And maybe what studies are needed? Maybe there's more research needed because some of the things we don't really have the answers. And can we speed up that research? And sometimes maybe that's a role of governments to invest in more R&D in some of these areas to speed it up so it won't take 10 or 20 years to get the data we need to even know what are the full implications.
Yeah, thank you. I think we've kind of drifted into my next question a little bit, which is fine. A lot of our audience are procurement people around the world or sustainability people, and some are quite new to this thinking around sustainable procurement and the type of things that we've been talking about. What advice would you give to people who are trying to procure in a better way?
Come with an open mind and to be willing to set aside assumptions or to question assumptions, which can be a difficult thing to do because it can be, well, we've always worked with suppliers A and B, and they've been good to us. And how can we suddenly work with supplier C? We don't know anything about them. Well, to find out. Or to work with your existing suppliers to really find out what they're doing and ask some of those questions. There's a lot of companies that are doing more stringent supplier codes of conduct. What is required? And let's audit those existing suppliers. And it may make sense to make some changes. That may cost money up front. That may be difficult to push through to management. So do your research so that you're not just putting forward something that they're going to say, why? This works. Why do we need to do this? It's going to cost X million dollars. When they can do their research and say, here's what it's going to cost. It's going to cost this much this year. Here are the cost savings over the next 5 years. Or here are the environmental benefits. Here are regulations coming, and we are going to get dinged if we don't do this. It's going to take 2 years or whatever amount of time they say based on their knowledge and calculations to make this change. The regulations are coming in such and such a year. We need to start yesterday. So let's do this now, and we need to find a way.
Yeah, it's a really good point about regulation. And as you say, it is coming around the world. From the work that you've done, you've obviously spoken to people in different parts of the world. How do you see the pace of regulation changing between different parts of the world? I mean, certainly, if I work with clients in the United States, they'll say to me, "Oh, we're 5 to 10 years behind Europe." Not in everything, there's some actually quite good legislation coming out of the states as well. How are you seeing different parts of the world varying in the way they're legislating around these issues?
Well, one interesting thing regarding the United States is the federal government has pushed a lot of decisions onto the state level. And so what you sometimes have is a patchwork of things where there's regulations coming in different states. And if they're large enough, they can influence the whole country. For example, California. The California economy is bigger than, I don't know, some number of countries around the world. I don't know the exact number.
It's the seventh largest economy in the world.
Okay.
Just behind the UK, as it happens.
Okay, how about that?
California on its own, yeah.
Therefore, California makes a change. If you need to make a change to your products to sell them in California, you're going to make the change to sell them everywhere. And yes, the EU has been ahead of the states in a lot of ways. I also do, though, see signs in other parts of the world. Well, one thing for the metals chapter, I interviewed some people in Zimbabwe who are in mining, and there are companies that are really more deeply considering worker safety, avoiding these kind of abuses that you hear and you think, oh, all the miners are using forced child labor. No, not everybody is using forced child labor. Some of them are really implementing safer, more, again, there's going to be an environmental impact to mining. We also can't just suddenly get rid of it either. So I see that. And I've talked to people in Malaysia who their concern is, okay, we're dealing with this plastics problem. And a lot of it is coming in from other places, from Europe, from North America. And I remember one business contact I know in Malaysia who showed me this cartoon, and she translated it for me because it wasn't in English. But basically, it's like this drawing of this pile of trash, and the source is coming from North America and Europe, and they're saying, and we're supposed to make sure we don't throw trash in the ocean. Hello, what can we do? So there is that need and the interest in educating people, and the idea that young people everywhere, whether they live in Malaysia, Zimbabwe, Switzerland, or California, they are interested in making a positive difference. I wouldn't say all of them, of course, but there is a difference. But I mean, we talked to somebody working in the recycling industry in UAE. There's different pressures there. There's different understandings, and there's different understandings of, wait, where does the funding come from to do different kinds of programs? And that is going to vary tremendously depending on where you live.
So it's back to, as you were saying earlier, we've got to ask those questions as procurers. We've got to really understand where our stuff is coming from. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes, as you say, cost pressures, time pressures, all of those things that get on top of you, it's really hard for people to do. It's also quite hard. I mean, you've mentioned research, and obviously you've done a lot of deep academic research in your career. It's quite hard for non-academic people to kind of get into the academic world, because you can read one paper that looks like it's really well referenced and go, okay, well, that's the answer then. But of course it isn't. In academia, It's about looking at lots of different sources of information. So, but you mentioned as well certification. If it's good certification, that can be really important. But once again, there is a temptation to go, oh, this thing's got a certificate. I don't really know what it means, but it's a certificate, so it'll be okay. And in some cases they are, in some cases they aren't. We did some work when we developed the ISO 2400 standard for sustainable procurement, looking at different types of certification, because they're not all the same, aren't they?
No, they're not. And there are definitely places where, okay, pay us a fee and we'll give you a stamp to put on your product or your website.
Yeah.
And so it's, it can be difficult. I mean, ISO is obviously, that's legitimate. It's also not a guarantee, because I see some companies like, oh, we're certified to ISO 9001 and ISO 14000, and therefore, we have an environmental management system, so all is well. Great. I'm glad you did that certification, but it's not as though you have to be the most stellar at all of this to get certified. You just need to have a process and follow your process. Now, the process of getting certified can definitely encourage companies to take a closer look at what they're doing. And I also interviewed somebody who works on helping people with ISO standards. And the idea that it's not just about documentation, and that's often a kind of false thing that people assume it's just about documentation. And having worked at a company when I was an engineer who was going through an ISO 9000 it was called 9000 then, before it was called 9001. Anyway, going through that certification, it did sometimes feel like, well, we just have to say how often we calibrate our equipment, and we have to actually calibrate it that often. But maybe it should be calibrated every month and we're only doing it every 6 months. Well, as long as we're doing it every 6 months and we say we're doing it every 6 months, that meets it. But it's a chance to look, and let's look at the data and how often should we be calibrating it to keep everything in proper working order and to keep our processes in spec, et cetera. I mean, that's just one example, but it's also an opportunity when you can look at all these different things and you say, oh, we don't really have as good a process for that as we wish we did. For the certification, we'll say, here's where we are today. But our recommendations are, we need to strengthen our processes and our policies in this area.
Yeah, it's about intelligent application of the standards, isn't it? I mean, I've always said with ISO 9001, you can set something out that says, we're going to make a terrible product that our customers hate and don't want to buy. And so long as I follow a perfect process to get that terrible product out at the end, I'll get a certificate. It doesn't mean it's a good product. It just means I've followed a process to specify that bad product, design it, manufacture it, and probably not sell it to my customers, keep it in the warehouse. That's still okay. It'll still be an ISO 9001. I know I'm being a bit flippant about the standards.
Yes.
So I actually remember when it was called BS 5750, and it was a British standard. And I was a lead auditor against that, but that was way back in the 80s. So yeah, as you say, we need to kind of, again, understand those standards when we're actually going out and procuring. A final question, and this is completely out of left field. You talked to me about endurance sports and the relationship between endurance sports and what you do. Tell me about that, because I'm not sure I can make that connection.
At one point I had a blog post, or it's a LinkedIn post, and what does swimming in the open water have to do with the work I do? And now I got to remember, in terms of what I said. But one of the things is about be prepared and understand your surroundings. So it's understand your environment, meaning you're not just going to jump into a lake where you don't even know if there's rocks at the bottom or there's who knows what is in it. You're going to already know, do your research in advance so you know what's happening. And if you realize, oh, the lake is 2 degrees Celsius, well, you should probably not just jump in off the dock. You should know this kind of thing. And another thing is to practice. You need to practice and learn, and you can keep learning and keep getting better at what you're doing. And don't go out there beyond your capabilities. And the other thing is to keep breathing. Breathing is super important in swimming. And just sometimes in life, in business, you need to just take a breath instead of just jumping in. Take a breath and think about it. And there's just a lot of analogies in terms of the preparation and training. You don't go in and say, yeah, I'm going to go run a marathon next weekend. I mean, maybe if you're 20 and you're fit anyway, you just do that, but that's probably still stupid if you haven't run more than a couple miles. And so there's, especially with young people, it's easy to be enthusiastic and to just jump in and say, we're going to do the things. And then the blockades come up. And what are you going to do when these things happen? What are you going to do when you were preparing for the race and you were assuming it was going to be 60 degrees out and suddenly it's 85? And how are you going to handle that? In the workforce, you assume you're going to be able to just go in and make this change, and then management says, no, you can't because of all these different reasons. So it's a matter of being resilient, keeping going in the face of obstacles, and also being realistic about what you can accomplish.
Brilliant. I love it. Thank you. And this is, of course, very relevant because there's been all the controversy about the Paris Olympics and the open water swimming. And, is the open water actually safe for swimmers to compete in? So it's a very...
Oh, yeah, I know that is a really kind of frightening thing. In the UK, I know some people in the UK who do open water swimming, wild swimming, and so much of the pollutants that are coming into the waters, it's very frightening and unfortunate. And I think also those of us who do swim outdoors, we can really relate to that need to not put effluents and contaminants and pollutants, organic or inorganic, into the waterways because we are actually in there swimming. Now, even if you don't swim, if you have zero interest in doing that, the health of our lakes, rivers, and oceans is critical for the health of all species and all humans, whether they ever step foot in an open body of water or not.
Yeah, certainly our water companies in the UK are doing us no favours at the moment. That's a very hot topic in our country right now. That's fantastic. Thank you. I think we've covered a whole range of issues. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about before we close?
I just want to tell people to keep working on making the world a better place through your work. And that one aspect of what I do is working with companies on developing strategic content marketing plans, but not doing greenwashing, which that's another thing, right? How are you doing what you say and saying what you do and not accidentally misinforming people? And so that it's important what you do. It's also important what you say. And I mean, ISO standards kind of feeds into that as well. Say what you do what you say, and think about your audience and how can you best communicate the message of the progress you're making, the good you're doing in the world without overselling it. And that can be tricky, but I advise people to do some real serious thinking about it because the companies that are out there making positive change should be talking about it so that others in their industry can see them as examples and to do it in an honest way that's saying, here's what we've done. We wish we could have done here, but we've done this. We've done this much so far. And here's the support we would love to see from our industry, from our suppliers, from our customers to progress further.
It's a really good point about greenwashing, actually. And I'm glad I asked you if there were any final points because, now in general, the world seems to kind of get sustainability and, it's a thing and everybody's woken up to the idea. So suddenly every product that you see is advertising its so-called sustainability credentials. And I think that makes it even more difficult for the consumer, because it's low carbon this and it's recycled that and organic this. And really, it's how real is any of this? And again, it's in this sort of unregulated area where new practice comes very quickly and regulation follows. So again, it's about asking proper questions and doing the right things, rather than just go, oh, right, we need a green one. Let's have a green one. We'll paint it green and that'll be okay. And it's not really. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Julia. We've covered a lot of ground in a fairly short time. I'm sure our audience are going to love it, and I'm sure people do send us a link through to the book. I'm sure your people are going to be very interested in taking a look at your book and also some of your other academic work. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.